I think it's the very first question that talks about.
Well, the first question is about the memories that you might have, and how often you attended, and what memories that you might have from.
Yeah.
living there.
So when I refer to do you want me to use people's names?
Sure, yeah,
Okay.
because those.
As opposed to mom and dad. My mom and dad were Ann and Jim Webb.
Mm-hmm.
My mom's parents, who are actually responsible for us getting here, were Martha and Keith Marshall. And they moved to the county in like 1953. So I just want to know about throwing their names out, or just say
No, I
grandma
think
and granddaddy.
I'm already started to
I
take you,
heard that.
but you don't. Again, we'll be deleting
Right.
a lot of this, but just to point out something to you that I did not mention. One of our parishioners works at William and Mary,
Mm-hmm.
and he actually asked me to ask all of the speakers if I don't have any documentation for copyright, but he said he believes that there's enough historical interest in Abingdon that we could have all of these things put in an oral history at William and Mary. So the more names that you bring to the table, if they're people that would be significant, or not even, just people that you think are important enough to mention, I think that's going to be good. It won't hurt.
I figured it might, if I could throw other members' names into
Sure.
the conversation.
Which is interesting, because originally I had thought that you can see right here, Keith. I had Betsy Aldrich and Keith Webb here in history.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you're the only person who's actually said to me, "Could I talk about some of the other people?" But I ended up taking you out of there because don't worry why.
It's okay.
It's just a lot of decisions on how we're making this work. So
It's okay. These David and Betsy have got years on me.
well, and David and Chris Evans together, their videos are going to be, I think, excellent. I'm actually not doing the interview with Betsy. I'm doing with everybody else, and I almost feel like, wait, now I want to do Betsy too, because I feel like I'm seeing trends, and I'm learning stuff here that I could ask about there, and it's actually been really fun doing this.
Yeah.
So far so good. So
Yeah.
anyways, all right, so your first memories, you came here as a result of your grandparents in the 50s. Your parents started coming here, so your family started coming to Abingdon when?
So I was born in December 1954.
Okay.
I was baptized here in the church in roughly April of 55.
Okay.
My dad, Jim Webb, and my mom, Ann, Dad was in the military, so we moved around a bit, but Gloucester was always home base.
Mm-hmm.
Dad would go overseas, and in those days, the families were not welcome to go overseas, so they had to find a place to live. So we always came to Gloucester and lived when Dad was overseas. I spent extended times here in the summer because it was easy.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have to worry about childcare and that sort of stuff if I was with Keith and Martha Marshall. And Keith Marshall was a early real estate developer here in the county, built the White Marsh Shopping Center, and had his hand in a bunch of different real estate deals and operated out of the house. And so we were kind of frequent long-term visitors with frequent periods of not being here on a regular basis until Dad retired in 1967, which is when Martha died. Keith Marshall died in 1961, and both are buried here at the graveyard. But in 1967, we moved into my grandmother's house down in Waterview, and when I came here, I was in the 7th grade, so I've been in Gloucester ever since then. Good number of years ago, I was in 7th grade. Graduated from Gloucester High School in 1973. I had a sister, Jerry Webb, and she became Jerry Northstein. And so we both grew up here in the county and both went to church here. Keith Sinclair, another member of the church, who was Jeff and Nan Sinclair's son. He and I were the only two acolytes that there ever was. We alternated Sundays, so I was here at least every other Sunday if I didn't come every Sunday. But
That name has come up before. I'm trying to put it in context, but yeah,
Yeah.
I can see that.
Jim Webb was nothing if not determined that I would go to church. And so we sat kind of center way on the right-hand side of the church. And I remember Bill Robbins and his wife Moira sat immediately in front of us. And I was always amazed at Bill's capacity. He had a crew cut. And all during the service, he would sit there and his scalp would move up and down and up and down. And it was just fascinating for me. And this would have been when I was probably, early teens. It wasn't like it was a 5-year-old fascination. It was just like, that's weird.
Things that you think about. When I got married, I remember Dennis Schmidt married us. And I remember sitting there being absolutely fixated because a bug was climbing down his vestment. And of all the things to be thinking about, I'm thinking about a bug on my wedding day. But yeah, it's strange.
Yeah. So in the early 60s, we hadn't built the parish house yet. And so Sunday school was happening over in the church. And there was no air conditioning in the church. So the windows were still opened at that time. There was a set of screen doors on the front of the church. And at that time, there was a vestibule behind the altar. Which in the 1980s renovation disappeared.
Right.
But that was where we would vest to be the acolyte. But I sat in the back left corner as you come in. That was my Sunday school class. And it was taught by varying women, always exclusively women did the teaching. But that was one of my earliest memories, was sitting there. We had a Hog Funeral Home fan. That was how we kept cool. And Mal C, who was Mal Sears Frazier at the time, she and I were cradle buddies because our parents were so close. And so she and I hung around a lot together. She recently gave me a picture of the two of us at Easter, and that was really neat to have.
She made a comment, not on video, but otherwise, that it made her mad that she couldn't be an acolyte. Did you guys have talks about that, or
No.
ever thought about that? You didn't know?
No.
You had no idea?
No, didn't have any idea.
What did it feel like when they finally, there was only 2 of you, I guess, for the longest time, but what did it feel like when they started letting, you made the comment that the women were the ones that taught Sunday school, which is interesting, because I don't know how much influence the ministers were having to you. Certainly the women weren't in the vestry. What was that like, you think?
Well, Howard Mueller was the minister during that time, and he was not the one who baptized me. That was Edgar Burns. And then Howard followed him, and Howard took me under his wing because I was one of the 2 that was going to help him during services. And he was very, I guess he maybe had some strong opinions, but he didn't really express them all that often. And harmony was really where he was shooting for, and I think he was largely successful in that. He gave me a job at the time that seemed Herculean, and the more I aged, the more I figure it was Herculean. I was hired to mow the property here at the church. Now, at that time, we didn't have the north graveyard. We just had the fenced graveyard, and we didn't have, well, this was in the 1970s, so we would have had the parish house, but the parish house was smaller. But I had to mow all of the property, and I had to trim around all the gravestones, and they paid me the handsome sum of $75 every time I did it. Well, I thought I was in tall cotton.
You just said something to me now. I'm trying to remember what the context is, but the idea that, you were an acolyte. I don't know who was teaching the Sunday school, but your friendships were strong. It was, somebody else said something about it being family oriented. You really were a smaller knit group, and it was just a rural family feeling. And I know that at some point along the way, you were military that brought you here, and others were too, but people started coming from other areas. And how did that change the way things were here for the church?
we've always had some percentage of military people because of our proximity, you know, to the military areas. The Arnolds, they were my first memory of people who were, you know, military. But my very first job ever was working for Colonel Henry Gant, who was also a member of the congregation, and he lived in Hollyknoll down at Gloucester Point, and it was a nice, you know, urban farm. And so he hired me for like $1 an hour, and I just was elated to have that work. But I got work through the congregation for, you know, various little teenage sort of jobs, and it was all because, as you said, it was a close-knit congregation. I mean, even today, our numbers are not staggeringly high. That you couldn't have a relationship with everybody if you came to church often enough. You know, at the time, I never went to the 8 o'clock service because that was way too early, and now I go exclusively to the 8 o'clock service. Shows how things have changed. But, you know, a lot of the names that are, I would say, are Gloucester, Abington history, I knew a bunch of them, you know, and some of them were just, you know, like Mr. Page. I would never dare call him by his first name. You know, it was Betsy's brother, Betsy Aldrich's brother. And then the Catlets, they were always Mr. Catlett. And
so I don't know, I have heard enough about the Pages, but I don't know who these people were in the community. And I find that's one of the things that I think is interesting about Abington is how many of our parishioners were also influential in our local community, and I suspect beyond that with the state. I don't know if there's any influence on that, how we as a church influenced the community and how the community or those leaders influenced us. That's just something I wouldn't mind hearing more about.
Well, I think it's a two-way street. You know, for the longest time, the Episcopal faith has been a generator of leaders in lots of things. And it's not strictly, you know, conservative leaders or liberal leaders. It seems to be fairly even-keeled. You got a little bit of both. But Lou Smith was a congregant here, and Lou was big into the grocery industry, and that was statewide at least. Well, he and my grandfather were big buddies, which is why White Marsh Shopping Center got built, because Lou wanted a grocery store there. So, and then Ben Garrett, he was a state leader, and so I grew up with, you know, his kids, and there was any number of people that had, and the Catlets, whom I mentioned, they were colonial era inhabitants along with the Pages, but they were the farmers as opposed to the gentility, which is what the Page would have fallen into. And the current Machicomico State Park was the Catlets farm. And so it was a huge holdings. And
do you think do you think that Abington was and is ahead of, behind, or on par with the things that were happening societally? I know Gloucester maybe is different because it is somewhat rural, but it's on the cusp of bigger cities. And so as society, nationally, statewide, and locally, do you think that Abington was lagging, ahead? What do you think?
Well, I think some of that reflects when you were passing through, you know. During my developmental years of teens, the Vietnam War was going on, and hence there was some societal unrest going on with that, and it permeated into this congregation. We didn't have any, you know, protests or anything like that, but, you know, largely the adults probably supported the war, and the teens didn't. And so there was the Pointers. I know that they were fairly, and the Spotswood, Brooke Spotswood. They were Woodstock generation, and so, you know, they were only too happy to, you know, support the views of the younger people.
You know, you're making me think. We have issues today of diversity. You know, just in the last 3 years, we've had quite a bit nationally to be discussed about that. As a general rule, over the last however many years, has our faith and our desire to be love thy neighbor, how has that? Has there been a lot of people, you think, over these years who have had to come to terms with what that really means? Or is there do you think?
Well, I think you either come to terms with it or you move on.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
The Episcopal Church in general leans towards progressiveness. And that's part of what I like. I mean, we say it so often in church, it's like, bring your brain to church. We don't expect you to, we're all marching to the same drummer. I don't think that's what we are. I think, you know, from some of the questions are geared towards feminism and the impact of women within the church. It was, you know, I think the first elected woman was Tyler Harris and Mrs. Tom Harris, and she was a dynamo. She was a force to be reckoned with.
The first elected woman to
Our vestry.
Our vestry. I was going to add, yeah, because somebody was talking about how that was the most exciting thing. Not whether or not we could be acolytes or limbs or whatever, but when the vestry included them, that's when things maybe, I don't want to say changed, but there was another perspective that came on board then.
Right. Women took on a leadership role, and their voices were heard a little bit more. Was doing a little walk down memory lane, and Wendy pulled out the minutes from the women's auxiliary because my grandmother had been a member of the women's auxiliary, and this would have been in the 60s. Now that was pre-women on vestry, and all of a sudden everything stops in like 1966. Now I'm not sure when women were allowed into, you know, leadership positions, not including, you know, ministry, but lay leadership. But I think the demise of one kind of pointed to the fact that there was something headed towards a voice, which being in the women's auxiliary was the voice. And as you read through it, it was Mrs. Tom Harris, Mrs. Keith Marshall. It was all of the Mrs. and then their husband's name. And, you know, and as you go through it, we all have our own identities now, you know, and I like that. I don't think my wife has ever gone by the moniker of Mrs. Keith Webb, ever.
I know she's like, I have a little placard that says my husband's name, and then mine says, and so-and-so's guest. I was, all right, well, I think we have actually backhandedly talked about a lot of these things. You brought up the Vietnam War, which is actually the first time that's come up as one of the things that might have been a point of growth or change or identity or whatever there. We talked about women. We talked about, we haven't talked about segregation and how the church managed that. And I know we have very few black members of our church, but we have some, and they are not the first. They've been before. How did that feel?
Well, the first black person I recall is Pat Hollingsworth.
Oh, okay.
Now, there may have been people that preceded her, but I couldn't tell you that. It may have created a little, you know, backbench whispers, but, you know, they started coming on a regular basis and they just fit right in, and no big waves. I think here in Gloucester, when I started school here in Gloucester was actually the first year of desegregation. And so I went to what had been T.C. Walker High School, and they changed the name to Gloucester Intermediate School. And a lot of the teachers were holdovers from the segregated classes. And there was a little bit of conversation about that among the school-age kids, but it didn't promote any discord. At the time, I think Gloucester maybe had 11, 12% black in its
Really?
in its population, and I would dare to say we haven't risen significantly above that today. I mean, maybe we're as high as 15, 20. I don't know, but it's still they're a minority. But we always got along very well. I meet regularly with the class members from my high school, and half of them are black, and we just love each other. It's just the best thing. We get together and we hoot and we have a big time, and we do this like every quarter. We get together, and we couldn't have done that if we'd had this animosity that was potentially there.
So it sounds like our community actually dictated a little bit of that to the church.
It did. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think we still have the spirit of that.
But they say that Sunday is the most segregated day in the United States because black people tend to go to black churches, white people tend to go to white churches. And, I don't know. I've been to a black church and been the only white person there, and I know how it feels to be the minority amongst the majority. And that's a feeling I wouldn't have had if I hadn't done that. So I can only imagine what the first black people to come to Abington must have felt. They maybe would have built up a little tolerance because that was their norm. Whereas for the white people, it wasn't their norm. You would have never gone to a black church.
Well, I think we've hit a lot of the topics. The one question I've been asking is, two things actually. What are some of the things that changes, things that happened in your experiences with Abington, changes that you think were really good and you're glad that they happened, and changes that you kind of wish they hadn't changed? And if there's anything that you would like to say about what you hope Abington will look like 50 years from now.
So I think a real key thing for me was when women were allowed to be in clergy. I've always, I guess, I wouldn't say I sought out females, but when I would walk into a church and there was a female, it was like, oh, this is going to be good. Because it's a different perspective. And I can only say that as a man. I don't know what the feeling is for a woman. But, I think it brought a different perspective to the church and perhaps enabled us to think a little more broadly than a paternalistic organization would have allowed the thinking to expand. So I think that was kind of the keystone event for me.
And a good change.
It is a very good change. I can't think of any bad things from a national church perspective. We've here in Abington, we've embraced LGBTQ plus, and
we've sponsored many seminarians, and some have been in that category.
Right. So it's not. I don't view it as a thing in our congregation. I try to live my life kind of centered, and I don't let things. I try not to. Nobody's perfect. I try not to let things that could be distractions enter my life. Like I'm not going to worry about that person's sexual orientation. Not my deal. Not my problem. Not my gift. And ditto for race. And so. I don't have a lot of problems with what's going on around me because I don't allow that into my sphere of influence, so to speak.
How much of that attitude do you think comes from your association with this church and the Episcopal Church in general?
It's hard because when you're in church every week, you get that osmosis thing goes on. I could have been developed as a result of going to Abington. It could have been developed as a result of growing up in Gloucester with a harmonious relationship between the races. I don't know if I could point and say that was 100% due to Abington, but I would say it certainly did not hurt it. It encouraged it, if anything.
And then again, to go back to the final question and say, if there's anything that you would like to see, or where do you hope that this church will be 50 years from now?
Well-
you're part of the legacy now. Your family is in our cemetery. It's not just you, actually. But what would you like to see?
Well, I've always been a real supporter of the youth in the church. I was the youth group leader here for a number of years, and I have made contributions to some of the trusts that are associated with youth development. The youth is the future of our church, and at this point in our church, we are at a low point of youth membership. And some of that it's not our church, it's more of a reflection of society. The society is getting away from mainline denominations, and we also have the secular activities of travel baseball, travel soccer, travel this, travel that, and parents are supportive of that, but that takes them out of the church on Sunday. Moving forward, I would hope that Abington would be able to get a few more kids in here. I mean, doubling what we've got would be a huge step, but hardly adequate. I like that we've got a devoted youth minister. I like that. I've always thought that what you don't pay attention to is what doesn't get done. And so if you don't pay attention to the youth, they're just going to be a sideline. And that's not good for the future. I think having a more racially balanced congregation is a bit of a pipe dream, but it's something that's not, it's not impossible.
Do you have thoughts with regards to what you just talked about on how to bring that diversity into the church? How do you attract to those folks? And also know that I think there are still members of this church who prefer to just keep it the way it is. They don't want just anybody becoming a member of this church, which I think it's just a blind spot. I don't think it's a true character issue there. But how would you bring them in so that it's a comfortable invitation?
And we've had this discussion. I've been on the vestry 3 times, and it's been a common theme. And kind of a side story, growing up in Gloucester, I worked at the pottery factory in Williamsburg, so that put me in Williamsburg every day. Well, when I got off of work, I would go to my aunt Sue Donaldson's house. She was Sue Sheldon at the time, and get changed and go out dating girls. Well, those girls almost exclusively came from Walsingham Academy. And so I still vividly remember we would go to Mass on Saturdays so that we didn't have to get up on Sundays. It'd be like, forgive me, Lord, I'm about to sin. And the Saturday service at St. Bede's was full of young people. And I think, it would be a tax on our current clergy, but it's a possibility of expanding membership. There's not a lot of Saturday church in this county, and if somebody was inclined to be, looking around for a home, and they figured out I don't have to do it Sunday, I can do it Saturday. Maybe that's something that would scratch their itch. That might be something. We've tried to make changes to accommodate the travel sports seasons, and that's had limited success. I'm not sure that it's anything more than I got 1 day a week set aside for me, and that happens to not. If you have it on Tuesday happens to be my day for me.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a hard thing given societal pressures. I don't think it's a sentiment against the Episcopal Church so much as mainline. We don't entertain. Some of the other churches in the community entertain, and that's just not the Episcopal Church here. I've gone to other Episcopal churches, and they have praise bands, and it's a much more lively service, but we don't have that here in Gloucester and Matthews.
Well, maybe that's something we can see in 50 years a little bit. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end this. We've
Okay.
had a long conversation.